Hello and welcome to On the Safe Side, a monthly podcast hosted by the editors of Safety and Health magazine, the official magazine of the National Safety Council. This is Kevin Drewley, Associate Editor at Safety and Health. With me, as always, are my fellow Associate Editors, Alan Ferguson and Barry Botino. Hello, guys.
Hey there, Kevin.
Hello, Kevin.
We're so thankful you've joined us for our June 2026 episode, number 76 in our history. This month's podcast is sponsored by SafeStart. This month also marks the 30th anniversary of National Safety Month. You can learn all about what's afoot by logging on to nsc.org or safetyandhealthmagazine.com. You also can check out our May episode of On the Safe Side, which featured discussion of NSC's National Safety Month efforts. We know that many of you have had a unique journey into the safety profession, and we'd like to learn more about it for the My Story feature in our magazine. You could submit a personal story by emailing us at safehealth@nsc.org or encourage a safety colleague to do the same. In this month's episode, we'll explore some key stories from the June issue of Safety and Health. We'll also speak about worker protections against heat illness with Cristina Campbell Harris, Industrial Hygiene Supervisor and Program Director in the Department of Labor and Industry at Maryland Occupational Safety and Health. Finally, we'll share some things you may have missed in What Else? Our In Case You Missed It segment. Is everybody ready? Here we go.
We start off our look at the June 2026 issue of Safety and Health with Barry's feature about safety on a small budget. One source says that while safety pros with limited budgets may be tempted to think their companies can't be safe if they're unwilling to spend money, there are ways to take advantage of low and no-cost resources, relationships with others, and ways to get creative. For example, as detailed in the story, OSHA has a number of free resources, including recommended practices for safety and health programs, as well as fact sheets on specific topics such as hazard communication. There's also a number of organizations, including the National Safety Council, that have free resources, along with state agencies and manufacturers. The story concludes with a quote that there's a whole host of solutions between the way it is now and the ultimate solution. That's where we live, the we, of course, referring to safety pros. Kevin has a feature story looking at how to engage with workers who are spread across different work sites. Communication is, of course, one of the main ways to accomplish this, and the story also delves into training tips, examines the role of technology, and looks at the National Safety Council's research initiative into this topic. Finally, do you ever wonder what terms like competent, qualified, or authorized person mean in OSHA and voluntary safety standards? Barry has a feature story to explain just that. He also looks at designated and certified person in the same story. This issue also features safety tips for June's National Safety Month, along with news, information about new products, and more, which you can find in print or at safetyandhealthmagazine.com.
For over 25 years, SafeStart has been serving clients with solutions to increase personal safety awareness and skills. During this time, they've become leaders in human factors management. They've helped thousands of companies, large and small, reduce injuries, increase engagement, and achieve sustainable culture improvement. Learn more at safestart.com.
Maryland is currently one of 7 states with a heat regulation and put that standard into effect in September 2024. With us to talk about that regulation and other heat safety tips is Cristina Campbell Harris, an Industrial Hygiene Supervisor and Program Director at MOSH, our Maryland Occupational Safety and Health, an OSHA state plan. Cristina, thank you so much for joining us here on the Safe Side.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our first question, what has been Maryland OSHA's experience so far with this heat standard, and are there any lessons that you all have learned in this relatively short period?
Last season or summer 2025 was really our first foray into enforcing the standard and actually going through the regulations and working with employers and employees to understand the requirements and help them come into compliance. We found that the majority of employers, from our perspective, had already been implementing most of the requirements of the regulation in practice, whether before the regulation had been established or after. It was pretty well received. For the most part, most of the employers and employees that we were in contact with were familiar with the requirements for water, rest, and shade. They were already taking basic steps to mitigate heat stress in the workplace. They may not have had some of the administrative written components, maybe not in a written plan or heat illness prevention plan. Maybe they hadn't documented training, but on the whole, we found that a lot of employers had already been doing a lot of these things already in practice, which was actually very good for, both the employees, and also our compliance folks that were out in the field. We did do a lot of outreach beforehand and information to everyone that we are in contact with every day, whether it's through inspections or our consultation services or our training and ed and outreach department. We're really pushing the heat stress regulations, particularly in the hot months. And we're pushing the resources that we have available for those employers. After this past year, we did figure out that we needed to do some targeted outreach in certain industries where those industries, for example, may not have been fully aware that there was even a regulation that was in place and that they were subject to. Small employers in construction, we noticed, we need to do some more outreach. The restaurant industry was also another industry where we felt like this time around this year, we're going to do a little bit more outreach and education, trying to get those employers to recognize that there is a new regulation and that they need to come into compliance. We also heard from the agriculture industry. So we know that we need to do a little bit more work with them in terms of developing resources, particularly for small farms with H2A workers, where their primary language is not English. So most of our resources are in English and Spanish. Most of the training that we do is in English. So we know that we are working on trying to develop more of those training resources and some of those programs to be able to help those smaller employers, those employees that only have limited language skills.
Cristina, I know you mentioned agriculture and some other industries. Are there certain types of feedback that you've gotten from employers and other stakeholders through this process?
The feedback has been largely positive. Some of these industries where we can do a better job of helping those employers come into compliance, we have created those written resources, whether they are the template heat illness and injury prevention plan. We have a lot of the webinars that we had previously done. We have those recorded and on our websites. We have those in English and Spanish. We have some, fact sheets that we've done. So all of that was very well received, I would say, on the whole, by employers and the larger workforce community. As far as the inspections that we had, most of them were related to some kind of formal complaint that we received in terms of heat. So we also know that employees know that they have a right to file a complaint and that they know that these regulations are in place and exist and are being enforced. So they are reaching out with complaints of heat stress. About 2/3 of the inspections that we did with regards to formal complaints that we received, many of them ended up with violations. Not a whole lot of them were what we would consider to be serious violations, because again, we had a lot of employers who were already implementing some of these mitigation strategies. So we were just missing the pieces of the documentation. Of all the inspections that we did last year, as a whole, about 6% of them resulted in some form of heat violation. It really gives us an idea of how much the community already really understands what the requirements are. And as far as the reception and implementing some of the requirements, employers really felt like they had the ability and the flexibility to be able to mitigate heat stress, implement the requirements, but in ways that really worked for their company and their businesses. And employees were receptive to that as well.
Cristina, if you had or could give any advice for any other state that's trying to finalize a heat regulation, what would it be?
I would say one of the things that Maryland tried to do when we developed the standard was to approach the standard from a performance-based standpoint, which again gives employers the flexibility to be able to implement some of those basic regulations or basic requirements within established parameters. So we really feel like this has been effective in terms of both employers coming into compliance and from the enforcement side, being able to enforce those standards. It's actually worked quite well.
Does your state plan to make any changes or tweaks in the regulation in the future? And if so, what are those?
We do not have any major changes that are being proposed at this time. We may make minor changes just for clarity, kind of based on how the implementation has gone, but that has not been done yet. We probably will wait another heat season to kind of see how things shake out, just to make sure that, we're capturing all of the little idiosyncrasies with regards to the regulation. For the most part, it's been working very well. We will keep the major components of the regulation.
Cristina, you spoke earlier about some of the resources your team has put together. Could you share a little bit about what resources that you do like to share with employers? And are there ones that have been more successful than others?
I think the model heat plan is probably the most widely used. It gives kind of a template or a framework for employers to be able to kind of answer questions as they're going through to explain how they are providing their water and their shade and their rest, how they're doing their acclimatization, how they are providing their training. So it gives them prompts all the way through. And I think that's probably the most useful resource that we have, because every employer has to have a written program as part of the regulations. Anybody to be able to pick that up, understand what they need to put in their plan. And then that also helps reinforce what they need to be doing in practice. I would say that's probably the most useful resource. But we have had a number of contacts reach out to us with regards to training and using some of the webinars that we have done as training. MOSHA's trainings are designed or developed to be able to help employers come into compliance. Anytime an employer would be using recorded webinar that we would have, what we always tell them is that you have to supplement with whatever your on-site procedures are, whatever you're doing in practice, you have to be able to add that to your training, because I can't cover that in a training. The employer knows what they're doing and how they're doing that. Another one that employers were happy to have at least some basic heat illness prevention information that they can share with their folks, and then they can supplement with their on-site, site-specific information.
Well, Cristina, thank you once again for this insightful conversation, and thank you so much for joining us on the Safe Side.
Thank you again.
With the 30th anniversary of National Safety Month upon us, June also brings the longest day of the year, our summer solstice. This month's In Case You Missed It segment is also long on news from the team here at Safety and Health magazine. I'd like to start out this month by sharing some news about a piece of legislation from Alabama regarding roadway safety. The Alabama Work Zone Safety Act was signed in April by Governor Kay Ivey, and that piece of legislation is going to establish a pilot program to procure, install, and operate speed enforcement cameras in interstate highway work zones. And this has been an issue in Alabama because the state shared some data that there are more than 2,500 crashes in Alabama work zones in 2025, causing 11 deaths and 709 injuries. And that program is going to start in October, first with a driver awareness program, and then full enforcement is expected to begin by the end of 2026, according to the governor's office. And I know, Kevin, you've got some data that you wanted to share, some federal data.
Yes, thank you, Barry. Let's take that baton for a brief roundup of recent data releases from the Department of Labor. OSHA, to start, has published final data on the agency's 10 most frequently cited standards for fiscal year 2025. And in case you missed it, I suppose you could say you haven't missed much insofar as, other than additional violations, of course, little change from the preliminary figures that were released in September during the NSC Safety Congress and Expo in Denver. However, two standards did switch places. You might recall from Congress that fall protection training requirements was ranked 6th, leading scaffolding by 2 violations. Well, in the meantime, scaffolding has taken over the 6th spot in the final release by a margin of 70 violations. I think we may have touched upon it in previous episodes, or certainly amongst ourselves, how Eric Harbin of OSHA had noted that a certain segment of people get into that sort of thing. Naturally, fall protection general requirements was at the top of the list for the 15th straight fiscal year, totaling 6,992 violations. And that was more than twice as many as second-ranked hazard communication, which had 3,010 violations. In related news, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, OSHA's fellow DOL agency, has announced that mine workers experienced a record low injury rate in 2025. Per agency data, last year's all-injury rate was 1.74 per 200,000 hours worked, and that compares to 1.82 in 2024. The all-injury rate MSHA notes incorporates deaths, lost time injuries, and injuries involving restricted work or medical treatment. And the agency cites enhanced training and enforcement as catalysts for the reduction in injuries. Alan, what do you have for us?
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. I wanted to highlight, in case anyone missed it, there was a study from the Economic Policy Institute that misclassifying employees as independent contractors can not only cost workers tens of thousands of dollars in annual wages, but it can also hurt the citizens in their respective states. EPI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank, and they analyzed 11 commonly misclassified jobs, including construction and trucking. And they found that misclassification, for example, can cost truck drivers between about $13,760 to around nearly $23,300 a year. And for construction workers, that range is just a shade over $13,000 and almost $20,400. The report also includes data for what's called light truck delivery drivers, home and health and personal care aides, retail sales workers, and landscaping workers, among others. Press release from EPI says workers misclassified as independent contractors lose out on critical protections, benefits, and labor rights, including minimum wage, overtime pay, unemployment insurance, the right to form a union, anti-discrimination protections in most states. And additionally, these workers bear the full financial cost of Social Security and Medicare contributions rather than splitting it evenly with their employers. Misclassification also reduces the amount of money in what's called the social insurance system by up to 30% per worker, the report adds. And that's because independent contractors don't pay into workers' compensation, unemployment insurance systems.
Well, for the folks out there in listener land, is there something you think that we missed? If you'd like to let us know, you can email us at safehealth@nsc.org and check out news from around the safety world at safetyandhealthmagazine.com. Thanks for joining us for this month's episode of On the Safe Side. We understand that your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending some of it with us, wherever it may be that you're listening. You can check out our past episodes by going to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/podcasts. Within those archives, you'll find episode 46 from December 2023, which features discussions on preventing workplace violence and an interview with a safety data sheet expert. The original music for this podcast was composed by Steve Maslin. Thank you so much, Steve. As always, we thank our NSC teammates behind the scenes who make this podcast go. And a special thank you goes out to this month's sponsor, SafeStart. Check out nsc.org/NSM and the Council's social media channels and YouTube page for National Safety Month resources and insights. We'll be back next month to have more safety-related discussions, talk to trusted voices from around the profession, and hopefully make you smile a little. Until then, please stay on the safe side.